In this episode of Everything Compliance, we have the quartet of Jonathan Armstrong, Jonathan Marks, Karen Woody, and Tom Fox.
Move on to our fan favorites of shout-outs and rants. Frankly, I can't wait. So we're going to keep the same order. Mr. Armstrong, what do you have for us?
Mine's a very respectful shout out, I hope. At the time of the Queen's Jubilee, my shout out was to the late, great Queen Elizabeth II, and we mourned but celebrated her passing this week. My pleasure and duty to say, long live the King, God save the King. I think King Charles has probably done the longest internship in history. He was the heir to the throne at aged 3, and he took the throne at aged 73. Obviously, he hasn't been idle in between. He did military service for 5 years in the 70s. He set up the Prince's Trust in 1976, an amazing charity. I had the privilege of working for the Prince's Trust on a voluntary basis in the 1990s. It set up, as I say, in 76. It still raises £100 million a year for good causes. I saw from my time there how active he was, sitting down with bankers and getting them to fund loans to underprivileged people trying to set up in business, and eyeballing them and effectively acting as the guarantor for people from underprivileged backgrounds he'd never ever met. I'm sitting here in Cornwall at the moment, and I've seen the great work that he's done as the leader of the Duchy of Cornwall. Things like the architecture projects. Nan Sledden, for example, is 10 miles or so away from where I'm sitting today. These huge social experiments, if you like, of building new towns that are scalable and replicate the community values that we apparently had in days of yore. So what will that mean for compliance officers? I think ESG is certainly, that whole area is on the new King's agenda. Will he influence legislation? Well, we don't know. Traditionally, the monarch's not influenced legislation that much, but we know that King Charles, when he was prince, had what were called the Black Spider memos, that he would handwrite notes to politicians to try and encourage direction in legislative policy. Will the Black Spider memos continue? I don't know. But will he pin his environmental heart on his sleeve still? I believe he will. So I think certainly ESG is going to be on the legislative agenda over here. And that whole thing about corporations should do good. He has used his own money, or the money allocated to him, to do good, to do projects like Poundbury and Nan Sledden and some of these built environment projects. And so I think it'll be an intriguing reign. Has Charles had criticism in the past? Of course he has, but is it a job I would want or think I could do? No, it isn't. And he has had that 70-year internship, so it'll be really interesting to see how his thoughts develop now he's got the big seat.
Karen Woody, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
I have done my rant already a little bit, so I'm going to move to my shout out. I also want to tip my hat to Jonathan Armstrong. I didn't think we would get from King Charles to ESG in a matter of 30. That was amazing. But here we are. So my shout out, I'm going to put back on my hat of Woody the film critic. So this week I watched I think it's on HBO film Elvis, which I didn't have necessarily high expectations of, but it is a beautiful, incredible film. And I have to say, I really appreciated seeing sort of the full nuance and detail of Elvis, who, of course, was a singular person in American history, and not really as the punchline of a joke, the Vegas clown scene that we see of Elvis, but to really see this impressive arc of his career, how his upbringing and sort of his childhood that was in poverty essentially meant that he interacted in a very racially diverse place and in a way that in the 50s that might not have been happening. And so that, of course, also influenced his music. And to see, I really, it's in some places maybe a bit heavy-handed, because I'm sure Elvis is not the saint that they paint him out to be all the time, but he really did do so much for the civil rights movement and on appreciating both music and culture that wasn't his own necessarily, and elevating that is really impressive to see, and really I think ties in this idea of responsibility of people in the world of celebrity, and the fact that people are watching and what that says. It is a movie that, much like watching that Titanic, you are like, I know how this ends, but I don't want it to end that way. But you do know how it's going. Tom Hanks plays the villain in some ways, his manager, who ensures that he keeps Elvis in a bit of a gilded cage. But really fascinating, and an insight that I don't think people younger than really my parents have much insight into when you think of who Elvis is or was. You just think of a goofy guy in a white suit in Vegas. But so that is my shout out to that movie. I thought it was great.
Jonathan Marks.
I'm going to do a rant today. It should be no surprise. So I had the privilege of speaking last week with the illustrious, extremely talented and credentialized Mr. Tom Fox in a little town they call Houston, Texas. And I did my normal thing. I asked the question, does anyone here understand or can give me a definition of an internal control? And 51 people sat there like I had asked them for the nuclear launch codes. And I go back to the fact that I even asked for people to try to dissect it and give me a definition. Do they understand that they're interlocking activities? Do they understand that they're designed to support the policies and procedures detailing the specific preventive, detective, deterrent, directive, corroborative actions in order to achieve some desired objective? Nothing. I got nothing. I got zero. I literally got zero. And my rant is this. It's great that everybody hangs their hat and says that they want to be a fraud examiner or internal auditor or anything like that. But if you don't understand the basic blocking and tackling, that scares the living you-know-what out of me. And so this is probably the 14th or 15th time I've asked this question. And I offer a significant amount of money each time if somebody gets the answer. And Tom, as my witness, will tell you that those 51 people stood there like I literally asked them for the nuclear launch codes for the nuclear football. And it just befuddles me to know. And by the way, I'm not picking on them. I truly am not. But I think it goes to some level of disservice to the professional organizations that these people belong to. And it also goes to continuing education and training, because we've gone to these such amorphous concepts about crazy things that I think it's about time that we get back to the fundamental and the basics. Because if you really break down and you're really a big fan of root cause analysis, man, the reason that people are getting in trouble these days is because their internal controls just suck. And so I'm done my rant.
I am actually going to give a shout out, and I'm going to give a shout out to Aaron Judge. For those who may not be familiar with Mr. Judge, he plays baseball for the New York Yankees. And I'd like to read the statistics of Aaron Judge as of September 21. Number one in home runs with 60. Number one in RBIs with 128. Number one in batting average with 316. Number one in runs scored with 123. Number one in bases on balls with 93. Number one with total at bats, 372. Number one on base percentage at 419. Number one with slugging percentage of 703. Number one at OPS, 1.129. And number one at wins above replacement at 9.7. But the one I want to focus on is the home runs, because 60 is still the magic number in my head. It's what I grew up with. It's what almost everybody grew up with before the 1990s. And he's at 60, and he's a Yankee. Babe Ruth set the record with 60. It was broken by Roger Maris in 1961, which, guess what, was 61 years ago today. So we had 61 home runs in 1961. 61 years later, Aaron Judge is on the verge of breaking that record. And it's part of a supplemental shout out. I'm going to shout out to the baseball gods, because the Boston Red Sox are in the Bronx this weekend for a 3-game series. And the hate between Boston and New York is beyond legendary. And I can't think of a better platform, place, TV station, any other way for Aaron Judge to break Roger Maris's record, who broke Babe Ruth. So Aaron Judge, great year, one for the ages and for the baseball gods. Thank you for putting the Red Sox in Yankee Stadium this weekend. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a heck of an episode, and I can't wait to see what we come up with next time.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance, Shoutouts, and Rants. You can listen to the full episode of Everything Compliance, episode 105, which posts on Thursday, September 29th. Thanks again for listening.